Hello, my friends. Does anyone recognize this place or this footage? This was actually a little bit of footage that I had in a previous sketchbook tour, which you can go back and watch if you want. It's called The Old Man of Storr, and it's on the Isle of Skye. And as many of you know, Isle of Skye is my favorite place on Earth, and it's my favorite muse. So I thought it would be fun to revisit this location and do a much more detailed painting. This video will be a tutorial style, so if you are interested in learning gouache, maybe grab your supplies and paint along with me. Even if you're not painting the same subject, I think it would help to practice some of the things I'm talking about while I'm discussing them. Since I'm doing a more detailed landscape, I started off with a much more detailed sketch than I would normally do. You might notice going along that instead of doing the usual thing that I show you guys, which is filling in a lot of the paper with a very thin wash of color, I'm working more in sections. And I'm kind of thinking about it as working from back to front. Partially because I'm practicing more of a cel shading style, not super strictly, but it's where you paint little sections of color instead of blending all the areas together. So it's a different style of painting and it's a little bit more illustrative. Excuse me, sorry, I'm a little sick. This style is really good for doing backgrounds for different illustrations or comics or animations. It lends itself really well to kind of a mix of realism but still more stylized. This first layer is just a very light gradient from blue up to white from the horizon upwards. And the reason for that is because the top area is going to be filled with soft clouds and the bottom area is where the sky is peeking through. So the scene overall is like going to be a more overcast, bright, sunny scene, not like dramatic or stormy or anything like that. So I do want a little bit of that blue sky peeking through. And then I'll come back in with very light, transparent gray, making sure to keep my lines more horizontal at this stage because I want it to seem like the low clouds in the distance are just kind of hanging there above the horizon. And as you can see, I'm painting around my rock formations in the foreground. As I said, with this cel shading style, you tend to paint sections or chunks of color next to each other instead of like layering up a full layer across the whole painting. In reality, I could have painted over those rocks with this light gray because later when I come back, you'll see how dark those rock formations are in the foreground. But since I'm not used to doing this style as much, I thought I would stick with it very strictly and paint all these little sections individually. I'll speed up the process a little bit so you guys can get a sense for how the gray shifts in color from when it's wet to dry, because it's very subtle, but it is there. And I'm just leaving a little hint of white, the first white layer showing through, just to give a sense that the clouds are a little bit bright on the edges. And then the final layer of clouds is just really thick white paint here and there, just giving those bright highlights a little pop. And we have to think about atmospheric perspective when we're doing this kind of scene because these very far distant mountains need to appear much lighter and less saturated than the foreground elements. Otherwise, we really won't get the proper depth in the landscape. The values in these distant elements are very close together, as in there's very little contrast. Because of the way light moves through the landscape and through the atmosphere, these little tricks will really help bring a lot of depth to the painting. And as I get closer to the foreground, I'll start adding a little more contrast and a little more warmth in my colors. So this mountain is getting a little more warm brown tones added, but I'm still keeping the details very minimal, if any. The whole point is to have these distant elements just be supporting characters to the foreground elements, which are the focus. And because of the angle that I'm using in this perspective, I'm really not going to see a lot of reflection. And I also wanted to make it look like it's a really bright day. So I'm using really light blue for the water. which will basically make it look like it's reflecting that really bright sky. There's a little landmass here sandwiched between two water bodies, and I'm going to add a little more warmth here. So I'm actually going a little bit warmer and brighter than I intend for it to be when it's finished. And the reason is because I can come back in with a more grayed, dull tone and minimize that brightness just a little bit. But this warm tone is going to act as a highlight over the landscape. Since most of my references are from when we went in the winter, the land was actually really not green. It was very brown, and there were burgundies and all sorts of really beautiful earthy tones. So I'm using that here. But then as I get closer to the foreground, I'm going to start adding in greens because I am just really excited for summer. And when I add green to the foreground, it'll really make it pop forward. It'll stand out from the background much more. Not only because it'll have more contrast and saturation, but there'll be pretty big color changes. So far in this painting, my strategy has been to lay down a bigger chunk of color and then come back in with one layer on top. But for this foreground, I knew I was going to be using maybe 2 to 3 layers, if not more. So I started off pretty thin. You can see how the green is pretty transparent here. And I also touched in like browns and stuff here and there so they could bleed together. But I just worked a little bit slower. I was so tempted to go over the whole thing with a big wash of color, which is like my usual strategy, but once again, I had to remind myself that I was trying to go for more of a blocky style or cel shading style, which it's just difficult to get used to when you're trying something new like that. But mostly here, I'm just trying to add texture into that first layer. So as it's drying, I'm touching in little spots of darker green or brown, and you can see that there's a lot of subtle color shifts happening. So I did deviate from that cel shading a lot in the grass areas, but I tried to keep it pretty strong in the other areas, which you'll see. I wanted to include part of the trail, so I'm adding that here in the bottom right of the painting. So this area is going to be much warmer, and it's going to have a lot more brightness to it in the end. So for now, I'm just starting off with a nice brown and sandy tone to just kind of indicate that there's a path here that'll be different than the grasses. In reality, it's actually more of like a stone or gravelly path. In some areas, it's dirt, but I just wanted to emphasize that it was much different than the other areas. When I came in to add the grasses next to the path, I knew I needed to make them pretty bright green, so I used a lot more yellow in my green, and that way they would stand out against the cooler greens that are in the grass behind them. At first, I just laid in a pretty solid color, and then I would come back in with some shadow tones and some highlight tones on the grasses. Overall, my strategy for painting this was to try to fill in most of the areas and then later come back in and fill in all the detail. For the main focus, the main feature of the painting, we have these amazing vertical rock formations, and it's why this place is so cool. So I wanted to make this the most saturated, most high contrast area of the painting, and even though I'm using browns and grays here, I really wanted it to stand out. So if I knew that if I started with this really dark layer, I can then come back in and work some of the detail into it and the highlights into it later. For some of the highlights, I decided to go with a bluish gray tone. So on the left, I'm adding a little hint of that color, and it's gonna just kind of fade into the darkness on the right side. And the reason I'm starting off with like a very subtle version of it is because gouache changes color when it dries. So I have to lay down a color and then let it dry completely before I can really assess whether it's dark or dark enough or too bright. And then I can go back and kind of adjust from there. These middle area rocks, I just wanted to kind of fade off a little bit to the side of the painting because they're not really the focus, although they are important in the landscape. They add to that rocky feel, but I just stuck with kind of a low contrast here and changed the colors a little bit here and there, but nothing too crazy. By this point, I was thinking, okay, I really should fill in most of the whiteness of this painting just so I can really get an idea of where I am with my values. The more white you have left on the painting, the harder it is to gauge whether you are on track with your values. So it's kind of a good strategy to lay in at least a base color everywhere, and then you can figure it out from there. It is really difficult to avoid getting stuck in all the details because I know what I want it to look like in the end, so I can easily just spend so much time on one little area and kind of ignore the other areas of the painting. So I really had to stop myself after a while. But part of the problem is when you're using such a small brush like this, it is just so easy to get into those details. Whereas if you use a bigger brush from the beginning of the painting, you have a much harder time getting into the details. It's one of my strategies for doing landscapes a lot. So use the biggest brush you can for as long as you can before you switch to your detail brush. However, I knew I was going to make this painting detailed, so I just kind of went with it. But finally back on track, filling in the rest of the painting so I at least have a nice base coat to work with. And as soon as I filled in those rocks, I realized that I really needed to make more of a difference between that middle grassy area and the foreground path area. And in that moment, it became clear to me that there really needed to be a deeper shadow behind those main rocks. So I added a little blue and black to my green just to darken it and make it a little bit cooler, and that would help make the rest of the grass look brighter. So I went back in and I added more of my shadow tones to all the little rocks and features in the landscape. And at this point, it's a lot about just gauging each brush stroke and deciding whether it's too dark, too bright, what else can you change in the painting to make it pop a little bit more. It's so many tiny decisions piled up on top of each other. So it's a lot of back and forth in the different areas of the painting, adding shadows and adding highlights, or maybe fixing a tone of a color here and there. And really just trying to add lots of texture and variety to the surfaces, because I don't really want a ton of areas that are just plain solid color, even though it is more of like a cel shading style, which, you know, let's be real, I definitely didn't stick with that too strongly. I tried, but it's tricky for me. I'll get better as the more I do it. But I did try to lay in chunkier highlights on these rocks to really bring that style out. And don't ignore your shadows. Here I'm adding a little bit of a greenish blue tone to the shadow side of my rocks. And this is going to indicate that the grass is kind of reflecting up onto those surfaces. And it is very subtle, but it's a little bit more noticeable after it dries. Which once again reminds me that you really do need to be patient in this process, because you lay down a color and it looks a certain way, but if you make a decision based on that right then, you might make the wrong choice. Whereas if you let it dry and see that color shift happen, you can make much more informed decisions. So basically at this point in the painting, I just need to do my final details, and that's the fun part, I think, because you can really have fun with getting super subtle, teeny tiny little marks that actually speak very loudly. So these little highlight marks on the rocks are just going to add to that brightness, and I can come back in and add some warmth or highlights to the grasses. And again, it's just kind of addicting to keep adding these little details. And finally, some little hints of flowers growing on the trail path, and then we're done. Did I mention that this is the last page in my sketchbook? This is my Sea White of Brighton sketchbook, and I've actually been really loving it. So I'm gonna do a sketchbook tour soon. It's been an amazing sketchbook to have with me. It's gone with me all over the place, including Jamaica. So I can't wait to show you guys everything. I know I packed a lot into this video, but hopefully you guys enjoyed it, and if you have any questions about my process or anything I talked about, let me know. As a reminder, my big landscape tutorial series is going to be released on May 1st, so that's only a few days away. This series is going to be released in separate parts. The first part is going to be how to paint and draw rocks, which, as you can see here, are so fun to do, and they're actually a really important part of landscapes. So I hope that a lot of you guys will be interested in that. It's going to be released on Skillshare and Gumroad, so I'm really looking forward to that. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial video, and I have a few more like this planned, as well as a sketchbook tour and a drawing video. So I've been working my butt off to just produce a lot of content, and I'm having a lot of fun with it, don't worry. Please let me know in the comments if I missed explaining anything that you guys want more clarification on. Your comments really help me figure out what I want to explain and say in other videos. Alright guys, stay inspired, and I'll see you again soon.